The snow fell lightly on the frozen surface of the lake as I led my daughter Mira through the heavy stone gates of Icehold Fortress. The wind was sharp, but Mira clutched her old cloth rabbit to her chest, its ears worn thin from years of constant love. I was 37 years old, a widower for 4 long winters, now earning my living by drafting land contracts and settling property disputes for the border lords. The work had made me colder, more reserved, and harder to approach than I once was, but it kept food on our table and a roof over Mira's head. I had come to Icehold at the invitation of clan chief Kargan Valthor, the wealthy orc lord who controlled the saltworks, timber yards, and docks around the lake. The letter had been clear: review the inheritance structure of the Icehold estate before the final council meeting of the year. I thought I was here simply to work. I had no idea I was stepping into a family that was rotting from the inside. The moment we entered the Great Hall, I noticed the stark difference between the two Valthor sisters. The younger one, Lyra, was vibrant and radiant. She moved through the room in a silver-furred cloak, drawing every eye with her sweet voice and effortless charm. The elder sister, Sira, was taller and broader in the shoulders, with deeper green skin and a sharp, watchful face. She wore a simple dark cloak and stood slightly apart, as if she had long grown accustomed to being overlooked. There was something about the way she observed everything, studying the roof beams, the stone columns, the newly repaired northern wall, as though she could hear the fortress whispering its hidden cracks to her. I noticed Sira immediately, not because she was beautiful in the obvious way Lyra was, but because of the quiet intensity with which she watched the room, like a woman who saw every flaw but had stopped expecting anyone to thank her for noticing them. Dinner began late. The long table was laden with roasted venison, spiced wine, and barley bread. Laughter and conversation filled the hall while Chief Kargan Valthor steered every discussion like a merchant directing his market stall. Mira sat beside me, fiddling with the loose knot on her wool scarf. I leaned down to tie it for her, half my attention still on the conversation between the two sisters. Lyra was recounting an old story about the autumn festival, how every young man in the valley had once asked her to dance. The guests laughed. Kargan laughed loudly. An old merchant joked that it was no surprise at all. Sira held her wine cup, offering a faint, well-practiced smile, and then spoke a single line that seemed intended only to fill the silence. "My sister is prettier. She always has been." It was clearly an old joke, one she had used many times to strike at herself before anyone else could. The table waited for the expected laughter. I looked up at that exact moment. I looked straight at Sira, not at Lyra, not at the chief, only at her, as if no one else in that room was worth addressing. Then I said, my voice low, cold, and calm enough for the entire table to hear, "I've never looked at her." The room froze. Lyra's smile stiffened mid-expression. Kargan's head snapped up sharply. A guest dropped his fork with a clatter. Even Mira blinked and turned to stare at me as if I had spoken something far too adult for her young ears. Sira said nothing, but I saw her fingers tighten around the stem of her cup, not hard, just enough to betray that my words had struck a place she had not allowed anyone near in a very long time. The rest of the dinner died a quiet death. No one could salvage the warmth after that moment, and as I led Mira up the stone stairs to our guest chambers later that night, I knew I had done something unwise. The strange thing was, for the first time in years, I didn't regret it at all. The next morning, I found Sira in the Eastern Stone Library long before dawn. She was already there, bent over the long blackwood table, surrounded by maps, tax ledgers, salt contracts, and documents sealed with red wax. When I stepped through the doorway, she did not look up. "If you came to apologize for last night," she said, voice flat, "you're too late." I pulled out the chair opposite her and set down my own stack of papers. I didn't come to apologize. Only then did she lift her eyes. The early light made her green skin look almost bruised, but the wariness in her gaze was unmistakable. She was not used to people speaking plainly without an angle. "Then why are you here?" Opened the top folder and turned it to the exact page I had marked the night before. "I'm here to ask why you're still sitting in this room when your father has been preparing to strip you of everything for at least a year." Her eyes locked onto the clause I indicated, a hidden subclause buried deep inside a salt shipping agreement with the Western Dwarven Guild. On the surface, it looked harmless. 3 layers deeper, it became lethal if Kargan triggered the debt at the end of the year. Every copper earned from the Southern Dock project, the one Sira had designed and personally overseen, would be frozen and transferred to a trust he alone controlled. I suspected something, she said quietly, but I could never find where he hid it. I found it last night. In one night, I shrugged. Men like your father assume everyone only reads the big print. They hide the knife in the small lines. Sira was silent for a long time. Then she walked around the table, sat down across from me, and for the first time did not keep the careful distance she had maintained at dinner. She spoke quickly without circling. The southern dock was her first independent project, stone piers on floating foundations, iron pilings driven deep into the lakebed. If completed, it would bring Icehold more profit than the last decade combined. But Kargan did not want her in control. He wanted to hand the entire estate management to Lyra, the daughter who knew how to smile at merchants, how to charm council members, how to become a soft, pleasing symbol instead of someone who actually understood load-bearing stone and trade currents. Lyra isn't stupid, Sira said, but she doesn't know the first thing about dock stress or cargo flow. Father knows that. Then why choose her? Sira gave a thin, bitter smile. Because she looks easier to love. People always prefer to give power to someone who makes them comfortable. Right then, Mira's small face appeared in the doorway. She was clutching her cloth rabbit, staring at Sira for a long moment before holding out a tangled skein of red yarn. "Can you tie hair for my doll?" she asked. Sira froze as if someone had struck her with something far softer than any blade she knew how to block. "I have never tied hair for a doll." "Neither have I," Mira said honestly, "but we can learn." I watched something crack open inside Sira's eyes, small, almost invisible, but real. By nightfall, we had gone through 3 trunks of documents. We still did not have everything, but we had enough to know Kargan's trap was elegant and nearly airtight. Sira understood that paper alone would not stop him. He could twist witnesses, twist feelings, twist the council itself. When she finally stepped out onto the stone balcony to breathe, I followed. The wind off the lake cut like thin knives. I took off my cloak and settled it around her shoulders. She stiffened for half a heartbeat, then accepted it. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. I looked out at the white fogged surface of the lake. "Because I don't like watching someone have what belongs to them taken away by the very person who should protect it." Sira said nothing after that. But from that moment on, the two of us stood on the same side. And for the first time in 4 years, the silence between me and another person did not feel empty. The next 3 days in Icehold passed like a silent war fought with ink and parchment. During the day, Sira and I pored over ledgers in the Eastern Library and walked the frozen docks, questioning dockmasters and comparing seals on old contracts. At night, we sat until the candles burned low, heads bent over the same pages until the space between us felt charged with something neither of us named. Mira took to Sira faster than I expected. My daughter had always been wary of strangers, but she trusted Sira in that pure, childlike way when she sensed someone wasn't pretending. Sira didn't know fairy tales, but she could carve tiny wooden boats from scrap lumber, tie leather cords into bracelets, and fix the wobbly leg on Mira's chair so it no longer rocked. Every time I saw my daughter laugh at something Sira showed her, I felt a place inside my chest soften that I had believed long turned to stone. It was in those quiet hours that I began to see what everyone else had missed about Sira. She wasn't just skilled at building docks or reading numbers. She remembered the name of every worker on the southern pier, knew whose roof had collapsed after the first winter storm, and could tell which bridge in the fishing village needed reinforcing before the ice broke. She didn't decorate her words the way Lyra did, but everything she thought had weight and shape and truth. Lyra began to change. At first, she only watched me with the cold hurt of someone who had been publicly dismissed. Then she started watching Sira more closely. One evening, I caught her lingering outside the library door while Sira and I argued over a hidden clause. The next morning, she slipped an old bundle of letters onto the table between us, documents she had taken from her father's private study. In them were copies of correspondence with the Northern Lake Council proving Kargan had planned for months to reclassify the southern dock as a private trading post, stripping Sira of control the moment the debt clause was triggered. But the price Lyra paid for that courage came that same night in the library. She broke down in front of us, tears cutting clean lines down her green cheeks. "I don't want him to take your part," she whispered. I only got used to standing where he told me to stand." Sira did not hug her sister. She was not that kind of woman. Instead, she stepped forward, placed one large hand on Lyra's shoulder, and said simply, "Then stand somewhere else this time." I witnessed the moment and understood the family was not yet completely rotten. It had only been ruled by one man for too long. Late that night after Lyra had gone, Sira and I walked out to the end of the wooden pier that jutted over the frozen lake. The wind was sharp and the stars were so bright they seemed loud. There were no more documents between us, no more arguments about clauses or debts. Just the two of us and the silence we had both been avoiding. "You should not have stayed this deep," Sira said, staring at the white ice. "I know, my father will strike back. I know that too. You have a daughter." Only then did I turn to look at her fully. The wind whipped strands of her dark hair across her cheek, and I realized I had stopped seeing her as a client the moment she first took Mira's tangled yarn. Because I have Mira, I said I cannot teach her that when something is wrong, you simply lower your head and let it pass. Sira was quiet for a long time. Then very softly she asked, "And if this costs you everything?" I gave a small, tired smile. I already lost my wife. Everything else I know how to rebuild. Her gaze changed then. It was not fierce. It was not obvious. It was simply the first time she looked at me like a man instead of a hired witness. We stood there on the frozen pier while the lake breathed beneath us, and for the first time, the space between us no longer felt like something we had to guard. It felt like something we had already crossed. The council chamber sat at the highest level of the harbor tower, its thick stone walls and narrow windows turning the blizzard outside into a muted roar. Torches hissed in iron brackets, throwing long shadows across the faces of merchants, dockmasters, two dwarven nobles, and the cluster of Kargan's loyalists. The air smelled of wet wool, melting snow, and old fear. I walked in beside Sierra. She wore her plain dark armor, no jewelry, no softness. Mira was safe with the nursemaid downstairs. I had left my daughter with strict instructions not to wander, then followed Sierra up the spiral stairs, knowing this room might decide everything. Kargan opened the meeting with the same calm voice he always used, the voice of a man who believed the world still belonged to him. He spoke of stability, long-term profit, and the need for a gentler hand at the helm. Then he dropped his proposal like a stone into still water. Lyra would be named co-steward of Icehold starting the new year, and the Southern Dock Project would be reclassified under a new trading charter for financial security. In plain terms, he was trying to steal Sierra's life's work in front of every witness who mattered. All eyes turned to her. Sierra stood. Her voice was clear and steady as she laid out surveys, construction contracts, and proof that the dock was a mixed civilian trading project not subject to the debt clause Kargan was waiving. She spoke without flourish, without begging. She simply spoke the truth, but Kargan had prepared the ground well. He called forward his old clerk to testify, the warehouse master who owed him favors and a guild leader whose debts he held. The net tightened around her words until they began to suffocate. That was when I rose. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed 3 leather-bound folders on the great table and spoke in the same even tone I used when reading contracts aloud. This proposal is void. The chamber fell silent. Page by page, I laid it bare, the secret letters between Kargan and the Northern Lake Council, the hidden transfer of debt, the private note ordering the delay of any announcement until Sierra could be removed after the final meeting. Every seal, every signature, every small clause that proved he had planned to rob his own daughter of her legacy. Kargan's face changed for the first time, but he still tried to fight. "You are an outsider," he snarled. "A hired witness with no voice here." Before I could answer, Lyra stood. Her hands trembled, but her voice carried across the stone room. "No," she said. "I am his daughter, and I confirm he has kept me here as nothing more than a pretty seal of approval. I was never shown the full accounts." Chaos erupted. Voices crashed together. Chairs scraped. Kargan turned toward his youngest daughter with a look of pure betrayal that had probably lived in that family for years. But Lyra did not sit down, and Sierra remained standing like stone. The true death of Kargan's power was not the documents. It was the moment both his daughters stood on the opposite side of the table from him. The council had no choice. They postponed the decision, ordered an internal investigation, and temporarily froze Kargan's financial authority until the matter was settled. On the stone corridor outside the chamber, Kargan blocked Sierra's path. "You think you've won," he hissed. Sierra looked at him without flinching. "No," she answered, voice low and cold. "I think this is the first time I've refused to let you decide who I am." That night, the blizzard howled against the fortress walls, and for the first time in many years, Icehold no longer belonged entirely to Kargan Valthor. The days after the council meeting settled over Icehold like quiet snow. Kargan withdrew to the western wing and sealed his doors. The men who once followed him scattered like crows when the scent of power grew uncertain. Lyra moved her things to the eastern rooms, avoiding both her father's shadow and the mirrors she had once used to measure her worth. Sierra did what she had always done when the world threatened to collapse around her. She worked. Every morning before first light, she walked down to the southern docks, checking pilings, ropes, stone stores, and the progress of the cruise. She waited for no praise from the council, no formal restoration of her rights. She simply continued building what was already hers. I watched her from the head of the wooden pier, Mira's small hand in mine, and for the first time, I understood that some people keep moving because stopping would let every old wound rush back in. That afternoon, Mira insisted on carrying a small honey cake down to the docks for Sierra. She ran through the thin snow on short legs, stopping in front of the tall orc woman and holding out the slightly lopsided cake she had helped shape in the kitchens. "I made this for you," Mira said. "It's a bit ugly." Sierra crouched slowly as if someone had handed her something far more fragile than cake. She took it with both hands like it was the most precious thing she had received in years. "So is mine," Sierra answered quietly. Mira thought for 2 heartbeats, then held out her tiny hand. Then we can hold hands and it will be beautiful." Sierra froze. I stood a few steps behind and saw the exact moment something inside her cracked open. Her throat moved once, swallowing something too large for words. Then she set the cake gently aside and took my daughter's small green-stained fingers in her own large ones. It was not a grand scene. No one cheered. No one even noticed. But in that small, ordinary moment, I knew we had already crossed every line that mattered. That night, I found Sierra alone at the far end of the pier where it jutted over the frozen lake. The blizzard had passed. The sky was clear and the stars were so bright they almost made a sound. "I will stay in Icehold," she said before I could speak. "The council wants me to take temporary charge of the southern docks and salt stores until the investigation is finished. I thought you might." "If I stay," she continued, staring at the white ice, "there is no going back to the way things were." I stepped closer until I stood beside her. "Does anyone in your life still want to go back to the way things were?" Sierra gave a small, soundless laugh. After a long silence, she asked, "And you?" "When this is over, you and Mira will leave." It wasn't really a question. It was the kind of conclusion people reach first, so the pain of being left behind hurts less. I turned to face her fully. The wind whipped strands of her dark hair across her cheek, and I realized I had stopped seeing her as a client the moment she first took Mira's tangled yarn. I used to think that I said, but now Mira keeps asking whether spring here will be warm enough for her rabbit to grow new ears. Sierra went very still. "She has only been here a few days." "Yes, but she chose you the day you fixed the doll's wooden leg for her." The lake wind was bitterly cold, yet the space between us no longer needed guarding. "And you?" Sierra asked softly. "What do you choose?" I had no grand speeches left in me. I was a man who had buried his wife, raised a child alone, and learned that some promises once spoken must be lived. So I told her the truth. "I choose the place where Mira can grow up without learning to shrink herself to be loved." I paused. "And I choose the woman I have seen clearly from the very first moment, even when the whole room wanted to look at someone else." Sierra closed her eyes for a heartbeat. When she opened them again, the guarded look was gone. She stepped forward slowly, as if making certain that if this happened, it would be because she chose it too. Then she rested her forehead against mine. No dramatic declarations, no need. Just the white lake, the black star-filled sky, our breaths mingling, and the soft sound of small footsteps running toward us. Mira stopped halfway, suddenly shy. "Am I interrupting?" I laughed first. Sierra turned her face slightly but did not pull away. "No," she answered. "You came at the right time." Mira ran the rest of the way and slipped between us, wrapping one arm around each of our legs as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And in that simple, heart-aching moment, Icehold felt like a real home for the very first time. The fortress that had once tried to break Sierra now held something new and whole. A man who had lost everything and found it again, a daughter who believed in second chances, and a woman who had finally stopped standing alone.